Fox News host Bill O'Reilly's new book, Killing Jesus, is out. What facts about Jesus' life, death, burial, and resurrection does Bill O'Reilly present? Today, you will find out. My guests are Dr. Darrell Bock, one of the leading historical Jesus scholars in the United States, and one of the world's foremost authorities on the Gospel of Luke. He is Senior Research Professor of New Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary. One of the books that Bill O'Reilly recommends that we all read and relied on in his writing is Dr. Bock's book, Studying the Historical Jesus, a guide to sources and methods. My second guest is Dr. Gary Habbermas, the Distinguished Research Professor and Chair of the Department of Philosophy and Theology at Liberty University. He holds a PhD from Michigan State University and has authored, co-authored, or edited more than 60 books, including one of the key articles in Jesus Under Fire, another book Mr. O'Reilly used and recommends we read. I will ask these two scholars to tell us what they think about Mr. O'Reilly's latest book about Jesus on this special edition of the John Ankerberg Show. Welcome to our program. We got a great one for you today. We're going to be critiquing Bill O'Reilly's new book, Killing Jesus. And we're going to be doing so with two of the leading New Testament scholars in the world. Bill O'Reilly himself recommended that we read their books. And today we're going to start with the main question of Bill O'Reilly's book, why was Jesus crucified? All right? What did Jesus say that the religious leaders accused him of blasphemy and deserving of death? And secondly, what crimes did the Romans accuse Jesus of doing that led Pilate to crucify him? Two different scenes. It's going to take us back into the story. What did Jesus say and do? And my guests are Dr. Darrell Bock, one of the leading historical Jesus scholars in our country and one of the world's foremost authorities on the Gospel of Luke. He's a senior research professor of New Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary. And Dr. Gary Habbermas, the distinguished research professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy and Theology at Liberty University, who has authored, co-authored, or edited more than 60 books. Guys, I am glad that you're here. I want to start, Darrell, with first impressions. When you read his book, Bill O'Reilly's book, Killing Jesus, did you pick it up as positive, negative? What strengths and weaknesses did you see in his book?
Well, the book is basically a popularization of the gospel story of Jesus, in which he runs through some issues of background as well as some of the core things that Jesus did and said. And it really reads as a paraphrase of Scripture. It runs through the story in sequence. Every now and then there's an interjection of a key Roman figure who has an important role to play, and so he's juxtaposing those two things. It's reasonably well done. It's not very skeptical, but there is a level of foundation underneath which you don't often expect in a popularization that isn't there, and so the rationale for why he's making the argument that he makes in certain spots is not entirely clear.
Yeah. Dr. Habbermas?
Well, I picked the book up and I thought, all right, I'm ready for the shoe to drop, you know, and so I opened it and I'd read and I thought, well, okay, I put a question mark or two, but I kept reading. I thought, this isn't bad. I mean, this is pretty fair. So kept reading and then I went to the end of the story because that's where I do most of my research. So I flipped it and I thought, this is even better than the early stuff. And I mean, there were little things here and there, but overall I was really pleasantly surprised. And then when I got to that last sources chapter where he lists many of the folks and found many of us and our friends listed there, I thought, wow. I thought, no wonder it was good.
Yeah. Now, the criticism, I think, is going to come in the weeks ahead from other critical scholars. And we want to, in a sense, strengthen O'Reilly's case here. And we want to point out, when you guys are looking at the sources and so on, how the game is played. And Darrell, he pointed to your book specifically about the sources. And, you know, for all these years, over 30 years, you have been examining all the different sources, and you've written huge books. You have had an international group of scholars for 10 years looking at just 12 key facts of Jesus' life. You wrote an 800-page book about those sources. I'm saying, come on. So what I want to know is, explain to my audience, they're not all scholars out here, some of them are, but tell them briefly, what are the rules to the road if you say, okay, we've got the New Testament, and you're not a Christian that just says, I believe this is from God, it's inspired and inerrant. If you're skeptical, you've got sources. How do you grade those sources? How do you know where you're going?
Well, it's really important to understand why we have the rules. We have the rules because some people say you can't trust the sources. You can't just simply open the Bible and believe what's there. So how do you make a case for believing what's there? It's the old journalist rule of I don't print a story unless I have two witnesses. And so one of the criteria, one of the rules, it's all about corroboration, and one of the rules is the idea of multiple attestation. How many different source levels that feed into the Gospels contribute to this theme or story? And the wider the spread, the more multiple the attestation, then the larger the case for the credibility that this actually did happen. And so the sources as they work are Mark and Q are the two most important ones. Mark is generally regarded as being the first gospel written. And Q is a combination of Matthew and Luke. About 200 verses in Matthew and Luke are shared that aren't in Mark and that deal primarily with Jesus' teaching.
Okay, when you talk about the sources, most people that are Christians look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then you got Paul's letters. So those are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sources.
Right.
All right? Now, you're saying that beyond that, when you read, say, for example, Luke chapter 1,
right.
Luke says right in the preface, before he got there, many others had written bits and pieces about Jesus' life, and he gathered that up.
Mm-hmm.
Those were sources. We don't have them at hand right now, but apparently he did. And some of them, he checked them out and found out these were eyewitness sources and they were good stuff. And you're saying there's something like that with this Q.
Yeah, Q is either an oral or a written tradition. That gets discussed. It's the material that Matthew and Luke share. It comprises about 200 verses of each of those Gospels. Matthew and Luke are said not to have used one another. The moment you do that, you've got to deal with where this came from. And so Q stands for the German word Quelle, which means source. And remember that the Gospels originally, there weren't written Gospels. They were telling stories about Jesus. These were being passed on orally because we're in an oral culture. And so this source base is one of the things that the Gospel writers drew upon. It was the church source base about the stories of Jesus. And that's what Q is. So Mark is one of the sources. Q is one of the sources. And then traditionally, the unique material in Luke is a source. The unique material in Matthew is seen as a source. And the unique material in John is seen as a source. And then there are others that can be spread beyond that. But those are the core ones. So that's multiple attestation. A variation of that is called attestation of forms. That's the different literary genres that something can appear in. That's like a cross-check, if you will. So that's the second standard. The third one is called dissimilarity. If it's not like Judaism, and it's not like the early church, it must be Jesus. Now that one is a tough sieve to get through because a lot of what Jesus does connect either to the past or leads into the future. And some people have done a variation on it called double dissimilarity. Not quite like Judaism and not quite like the early church. And if you can show that it's in the movement between those two, then that can count too. That's another standard. The fourth rule is embarrassment. The early church wouldn't write something like this. They wouldn't castigate one of their leaders and put them in this frame and show them in this way unless it really happened that way. And then the last one is the criterion of rejection. We have to be able to know how the event leads to the ultimate rejection of Jesus. So those are 5 of the rules. They're not all of them, but those are 5 of the rules that we play the game by, all designed to corroborate or verify the claim that this particular theme or event or saying happened.
Gary, how do you give weight to, how many of the sources do you have to have for it to be considered good evidence? 1 source, 2 source, 3 source, 4? Where do you as scholars say, I think we got something here that we can rely on?
Well, just like in a court of law, there's no rule on what you have, how many you have to have, because I think you want to, Darrell mentioned different kinds of attestation. You have to kind of weigh the kind of attestation. You've got the rules. You've also got the specific, subcategories within each one. What kind of attestation? Are the two kinds of attestation you have both late, or are they both early? Do you have, if you have Mark and Q, now you're or if you have a secular source for something, those count with folks. But so you have to kind of pull those apart and look at them. But the Jesus Seminar says that if you have two sources, independent sources for a saying of Jesus, that increases the likelihood. Well, if two might do the job, what do you do with the Bart Ehrman, who's probably the best-known skeptic in this country? What do you do when he says he's got about a dozen sources for the crucifixion of Jesus? I think if two is pretty good, we know a dozen is overkill, and that's why the crucifixion of Jesus is so well accepted.
And you've got to appreciate the fact here that these criteria are discussed and debated. This isn't a science where everything lands, and it's clear. This is why it gets discussed, is because you're weighing evidence, and that's what a historian always does.
And our position here is if you weigh this evidence, we can support what is said in the New Testament Gospels.
That's right. That their core credibility can be defended, and it can be defended on a basis that says more than simply, well, it's true because it's in the Bible. Here's why it's true. Here's why anyone looking at this should take it seriously that these things happen.
Talk about your brother.
Yeah, the book that I did, Who is Jesus, was written in part because my brother, who was trained in the Ivy League as a lawyer, was skeptical about religion. And so we engaged a discussion on Jesus, and I couldn't just cite the Bible to cite the Bible. As a lawyer, he would sit there and he would say, well, let's put you in the docket and take a look at this. And he would bring good questions. And so we engaged in this conversation over a long period of time, discussing the evidence using these kinds of rules as a way of drawing him in to think about what was in the Scripture. And this, along with just the credible testimony of people's lives, etc., eventually opened him up to being responsive to the gospel.
All right. Folks, we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back, and we're going to talk about, okay, how is this evidence applied to the question, why was Jesus crucified? How did O'Reilly handle it? How would you guys advise him to strengthen his case? We'll talk about that when we come right back.